各位，在一场围绕委内瑞拉局面和大国行为的讨论中，法国多位长期研究国际法和战略问题的学者不约而同地触及了同一个困惑：如果所有人都在引用法律，却各自只承认对自己有利的那一部分，那秩序的本身是否已经发生了变化？美国针对委内瑞拉的行动被许多人形容为一次成倍放大的事件。表面上来看，它削弱了俄罗斯的重要盟友，也延续了此前对伊朗的高压路线。但与此同时，它直接触碰了另一个更敏感的问题，那就是国际法是否依然有约束力。讽刺的是，几乎所有相关方都在谈论法律。美国官员强调法院签发的逮捕令，强调这是一个法治的延伸；俄罗斯则援用联合国海洋法公约，指出任何国家都无权在他国管辖范围内动用武力。双方的语言相似，但逻辑完全相反。而真正的分歧不在条文，而在适用的范围。美国的做法并非试图在国际法框架里面寻找共识，而是将国内法直接复释到国际空间，把美国法律视为可以全球执行的规则。这意味着，当国际规范和美国国内法发生了冲突的时候，后者会默认拥有最终的裁决权。这一种逻辑一旦被接受，其影响不会局限在加勒比海。学者们指出，如果强国可以依据自身的判断，然后越过边界来行事，那么乌克兰、格陵兰岛、台湾等国际问题都被重新放置在谁有能力执行的意志坐标系里面，而不再是谁拥有合法性。风险并不一定表面为全面的战争，但更有可能来自失控的边缘时刻。一次的拦截，一场的误判，一个不该死亡的人，都有可能迫使政府做出象征式甚至是升值性的回应。在和大国并存的环境下，这一种偶发性本身就是一个结构性的危险，而欧洲在这一场变化中尤为被动。一方面，它依赖着美国的安全保护，而另一方面却发现自己无法对规则的破坏提出有限的制衡。即使是在巴黎举行的会议上，国际法并未成为核心议题，而取而代之的是如何在现实上跟上节奏。从战术的角度来看，这一种强硬路线确实展示了效率。它向伊朗、俄罗斯、中国以及其他潜在的对手递出了一个明确的信号，即便远在边界之外，也不存在真正的安全之地。委内瑞拉问题的本身已经对高度介入该国能源和金融体系的中国造成了直接的冲击。但问题在于，战术的成功并不会自动转化为长期的稳定。当国际秩序不再被视为共同约束，而只是强者的工具的时候，弱者会寻找对冲的方式，而强者必须持续投入力量来维持威慑。秩序的成本并没有消失，只是被推迟和放大。因此，这一次围绕着委内瑞拉的行动，并不只是一场地区的事件，而更像是一场测试。它考验的不再是某个政权的合法性，而是世界是否在默许一个新的前提，那就是强权面前，规则只是选项。让我们看一下视频。
U.S. actions against Venezuela have bear a whole panoply of consequences, and we're yet to determine whether they're positive or negative. On the one hand, an important Putin ally has been basically arrested and whisked away to the U.S. So the standing of Russian standing internationally has been weakened, as it has been before with the U.S. strikes against Iran. But, you know, the considerations of international law, of the respect for borders, those have been sort of norms, international norms that Ukraine has been appealing to and, you know, relying on. This builds its whole case on. And clearly the U.S. operation against Maduro has been in breach of those. But I do agree with the colleague that, you know, the action against the Shadow Fleet, Russian, Venezuelan, or any such vessels is a welcome development.
We heard both the White House press secretary and the Secretary of State, Mark Burley, point to a warrant by U.S. courts for this action. We talk about the law. The Russian reaction, I'll read it to you, is no state has the right to use force against the vessels duly registered in the jurisdiction of other states, and they cite the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's interesting how the law is being mentioned on both sides here.
Well, I'm not going to explore too much what Russia thinks of international law, but looking at the US, what we're sort of seeing, I think it's like kind of like a direct line. What we're seeing in Venezuela and this interdiction of the ship is it's US law which is being applied on the international stage. So it's basically Washington ignoring whatever international laws apply, assuming that their law is international and going with it.
Right. And so?
And so, what do you? I mean, if you're gonna go down the route of might is right and big power rivalries, I mean, you're talking about military power. Nobody can confront the combined military might of the US. I mean, if we're going to talk about Greenland, the Europeans are never going to be able to defend from a US invasion. That's just not practical. We're now, what we're seeing with him going after what is considered now a Russian asset after the flag change in the mid-Atlantic is we're starting to see, okay, Russia is not on the same par as America in terms of military might globally, but in specific theaters, it can put up a pretty good, a pretty good response to this. And so, what are we about to sort of see something like this as finally a trigger between a military to cause a military confrontation between the US and Russia? I mean, I don't know. Anybody who's been following Trump recently, he talks more about his friendship with Putin than he does about the old Cold War rivalries that could end up in some sort of like shooting war. It's all a bit confusing. Personally, I don't think that what we're going to see here is going to end up in any sort of military confrontation, but it does open the way to some sort of like accident happening, something getting out of control, something, somebody dies who isn't meant to die, and then a government has to take a symbolic or a larger reaction, which usually involves a use of military force. I don't have any answers, but it's interesting times.
Peter Doran, we're confused because there's been the pressuring of Ukraine's president, which has stunned European allies by Donald Trump. And then we saw on Tuesday here in Paris, his envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, endorsing a plan which should effectively halt eventually Russia's westward march. Is the Trump administration turning against Moscow?
Well, let's put this confusion to rest. And I think it's very straightforward. A lot of people have expressed their concern that perhaps Russia or China would point to America's action as an excuse or justification for, say, Russia's illegal aggressive war against Ukraine. But let's look at the facts here. Ex-President Maduro was not a legitimate president. The European Union knew he stole his previous elections. We knew he stole his previous elections. Now, compare and contrast that to President Zelensky, who is a legitimate president. So we're comparing apples to oranges here, and that could be where the confusion lies. But more importantly, and this is something that Europeans often don't quite understand about the United States, when we talk about international law is just a treaty. The UN Charter is just a treaty. And the United States, for over 75 years now, has been very clear, no international treaty trumps our domestic laws. So President Trump is simply acting under our Constitution, under our rule of law. And when there's a conflict with the UN Charter, then our American laws are supreme.
Mariana Bujarin, you agree?
It's a little difficult to agree with that. I mean, certainly, might has been right in international relations. There isn't a supranational enforcement agency that can force a powerful state to act in accordance with international law. But generally, states have been following following some kind of self-restraint, right? They have heeded these international norms and were restrained by them to some measure, even the powerful states. For instance, for the United States, for a successive administration, it has been important to be sort of on the right side of history, to be the good guy in the international relations. That seems to be very different for this administration. There's certainly zero regard for international law as any kind of restraining factor. There's no debate that Maduro was a bad guy, right? But does that justify the breach of international borders, the international recognized borders, and the unsanctioned use of military force? That argument, again, can go both ways here in Ukraine. Yes, President Zelensky is the legitimately and democratically elected leader, and yet a mighty state, a powerful state, illegally used military force to invade this country, right? If that's game for any powerful state, then, well, watch Greenland next and watch Taiwan next.
All right, we're seeing live images there from Caracas, where the regime there is keeping a tight lid on what's going on. Again, we're talking about these ships. The administration, Marco Rubio in particular, pointing to warrants by U.S. courts to seize sanctioned ships. His boss, he's been talking about oil on Truth Social. Donald Trump claiming he'll be keeping 30 to 50 million barrels of seized Venezuelan crude. Andrei Luzakug-Petri, we're still you realize it's only been since Saturday that Nicolas Maduro was seized. We're still processing it. What's it all about?
Well, it seems that it all reminds me of this exceptional movie, The Apprentice, that I think we should all see again, where there's 3 lines for Donald Trump. One is attack, attack, attack. Secondly, truth is what you say about it. And third, never concede defeat. And you see this playbook happening right now. There is an incredible tactical opportunity. Number one, to obviously take away this basically this platform for Iran, for China, for Russia. That's the U.S. Of course argumentation about Venezuela. Two, to hit relatively badly China in particular, which was getting a lot of its oil out of Venezuela, and which is also financially heavily invested through its development banks into the ailing country, because I remind 80%, I think, of the GDP disappeared in the last 10 years. So it was really financially supported by China.
And they'd have to write off some of those loans.
They will have to write off, obviously, because the country is now apparently practically under the control of the U.S. government. That's at least what the U.S. government is saying. And third, there's the tactical aspect that this message that nobody is safe, even beyond within its borders, is a message to a huge number of bad or less or good or less good actors worldwide. Think about Iran in particular. And the message to the Europeans is also clear too. I mean, the fact that, especially in our country, President Macron was so timid. He actually did not talk about international law at all in his first reaction toward after the extraction of Maduro, was obviously thinking about what happened yesterday in Paris, this presser where there was the coalition of the willing, which he wanted to make a success, and which is on paper a success because he built this coalition of reassurance.
Yeah, framework if ever there's a
and I think Donald Trump knows that perfectly. That right now the Europeans, number one, they need the U.S. protection for the military, and secondly, they need him double to have any kind of progress in Ukraine. So he's just pushing its advantage. So tactically, I must say, it's admirably played. The question is for the Europeans, and that's really the question, is by showing deference Yes, you seem to achieve some short-term tactical gains, like the French president did yesterday, but I think long-term is catastrophic because we're just expressing a huge sign of weakness.